What is good, everyone? Welcome back to the What Would It Take podcast. I am here this week with a super special guest. This might be one of the first times I've had a guest on this podcast, and so I'm excited for that reason, but also excited at the person that's here. I'm joined by my dear friend and adopted family member, Kibler Hidalgo. Kibler, welcome today. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's a pleasure.
Kibler is I wrote this down, so I want to make sure I get it correctly. Your intro. All right. Kibler is an urban Apache, German Jew, queer, femme, two-spirit woman, a mother, auntie, cousin, niece, and wife. I don't know if you have that out there as well. It's true, but does it get broadcast? I don't know. Yeah, okay. As well as a social scientist by trade, and someone that I consider a leader, an elder, and a healer in the community. And we're here to talk about and to answer the question, what would it take to keep our Native family safe? So once again, welcome, Kibler. Is there anything you want to add to your introduction so folks know more about who you are?
Multi-hyphenated, a lot of roles, definitely a matriarchy. Not an elder quite yet, but definitely in my training. I would say an entrepreneur, consultant, partner, of course. I have a business partner and a partner that I love, that I'm here with. And I am in the occupied territory of the Pachanga Band of the Laos Indians, now called Southern California, or the Inland Empire. And I am a displaced Mascalero Apache.
Excellent. Thank you. So definitely qualified to have the discussion that we're going to have today. And I'll let folks know that Kibler and I have known each other for well over 10 years. I don't know the exact number of years, but it's been a minute. And so we knew each other when. So we've got some history. And so the vibe of this discussion will probably be a little different than the normal vibe of the podcast in all the best ways. But starting out, when we talk about, or when people talk about Indigenous folks and Native population, I know I used to have a very narrow understanding of who I was talking about or the type of people I was imagining. Can you just kind of paint a broad stroke picture of the diversity of the Indigenous Native community, especially as it relates to what we call Turtle Island?
Absolutely. So just like in that broad stroke of Turtle Island, what we mean is the U.S., right? Or what is now called the U.S. So in that empire, well, before we even get there, let's just say that the continent of America, right, which encompasses what's now called Canada, what's now called Mexico, we're indigenous through and through, as well as in South America, as well as in the continent of Africa. There are indigenous people all over the world. But this discussion, we're going to take a kind of more detailed approach at folks just here on Turtle Island, because that's where my people are from.
Yeah.
So just on Turtle Island, now the U.S. Empire, we have over 574 federally recognized tribes. And I can't speak to all of them. And we talked about that a little bit earlier. As somebody who's a descendant of the Apache Nation, we have 8 recognized tribes. So just Apache folks alone. And that doesn't even comprehend the folks that are no longer recognized under the Indian Act, which is our federal level of how we identify. And we talked a little bit about, some members of my family are registered under the Indian Act and some of us aren't. So I'm 3rd generation off the reservation, and I am an unregistered urban Indian, meaning that my dad stopped his registry during Nixon, or said he no longer wanted to be identified by the federal government as Native American because he didn't want to receive benefits. Not that they're much, but at that time there was a big push by the government to say, hey, you don't need the help. And what that really was doing was continuing on the genocide, which we'll get deeper into, but that eradication of Native populations. So out of that 575, there's hundreds more who are still fighting to be federally recognized or to get their tribal status back or nation status back.
Wow. And, you and I have a weekly standing call. And so we've connected almost every week for at least the last 12 to 18 months. And I did not know that there were 8 different Apache tribes. So even I'm learning something new today, which is why I wanted to have you on here. That's wild.
It
And
is.
so one of the things I've learned from you about indigenous culture and native culture has been the importance of community and the traditions and the way that indigenous folks still are able to hold on to and retain the stories about who they are and why they are. A conversation you and I have had frequently is you talking to me about the Apache folks being warriors and other tribes, other clans being makers of pottery, jewelry, hunters. So can you just talk about some of those? I'll call them cultural distinctions, even amongst tribes.
Absolutely. So I think you and I, we've talked a lot about what it means to be like a Southwest native. You know,
Mm,
my Apache people are in southern New Mexico, but there are Apache people in Arizona. There are Apache people in southern Colorado, Texas, the northern belt of Mexico, Chihuahua, Sonora. We are spread across quite a distance of land. Um, but all of us seem to have that we were warriors, raiders, and farmers in common with all those bands, tribes underneath the nation. And so I think when we think about our neighbors, for us, the Apache to the west, our Navajo or Dene relatives, you know, there are silver workers. They make
mm,
beautiful jewelry. And we have Hopi relatives and Pueblo relatives like the Isla Pueblos who make beautiful baskets and pottery. And we do as well, but that wasn't our main focus. And I think once colonization happened, like a little over 120 years ago, that's really when we started to change over from our, you know, our pre-contact culture to what we now live in, right? Our post-contact culture, of just now, you know, I'm not out farming, right? And I'm not out doing traditional war tactics or guerrilla warfare, but those stories are still passed on and important to the cultural identity. And I still feel like some of that knowledge runs through my blood, even though
yeah.
it's not able to be used all the time. It's still very much alive in me, and my young ones, I see it in them
Mm,
as well. I think we had a really good conversation a few days ago about my partner is Yaqui from the Snow Mountains of Mexico, and how, you know, some Apache folks call the Yaquis the Apaches of Mexico.
yeah.
And, you know, standing around with three Yaquis, they're laughing at me saying, oh, no, you know, you guys are real tough. You know, you guys are warriors. We're just farmers, you
Mm,
know, and kind of having the cultural distinction between us, I think is really cool. But something that we still remember, right? Because that is a part of our identity.
yeah.
So just, and you know, when you go farther east, you know, I don't know about all of our relatives to the east, or all of our relatives to the far west, but you know, the Kosalic folks, you know, those are our fishermen. I couldn't tell you a bit about fishing because we're from the desert. I
Famously
can't.
not great for fishing.
Not no Apache, not fishermen. But you know, each tribe has our own set of values, has our own purpose, our own religion, our own creation story. There's even a variation in the creation stories between us Apache folks.
Mm,
So, you know, everyone's very distinct, and everyone has a bit of the truth, and everyone's creation story is right for them.
yeah.
And that's a big part of the teachings I was given when I was little. So
Mm.
I just really respect folks, when they have their creation stories and they have a piece of their cultural identity still alive in them. There's been a lot done to eradicate those stories and those memories from us, so keep going.
Right. That's part of the process of colonization and genocide, which we're gonna talk about here in a second. As people, so growing up, we had U.S. history and Indiana history, and again, I have a disclaimer: Indiana education, which not known to be top notch in
Low
terms of
bar, low bar.
right, right, not the highest of bar in terms of education, especially when it comes to objectively true history. Okay, not known for that. So we learned about Native Americans in school, sure, but I had no idea that there were over 500 recognized tribes. I knew of like maybe 10, right? Especially some in the Midwest. Um, and as I've gotten older, I don't know even a lot of Native folks, but I've heard and observed that language, as it has with many other people of color, has started to shift in terms of how people want to be identified. And so, growing up Native folks were referred to as Indians, for instance. Can you talk about not? I don't even care what the politically correct term is, but in terms of the diversity of language, if someone is in relationship with someone who identifies as Indigenous, generally, how do folks want to be identified, or how do you personally want to be identified and spoken about?
I would say, it's best to ask,
Hmm.
right? But usually folks want to be identified with their tribe and with their nation or with their clan. And outside of that, Indigenous has become extremely popularized. I think it's a great term. Sometimes it doesn't encompass all the people I feel it should, right?
Hmm.
Because I think we don't often use Indigenous for when we're talking about the continent of Africa, but that should be a word that we
Yeah,
use more often.
yeah.
But I really like Indian, like an N, a D,
Hmm.
and an N.
Hmm.
And when I was a little kid, I remember I asked my dad, who is my native parent, Dad, why do they call us Indian? And I really had this fascination for the country of India.
Sure.
I was like, why do they call us Indian? We're not like them. We don't wear bright colors. And he's like, we call ourselves Indian to always remind, the white man that came here how stupid he was. He didn't even know what we are. And he was calling us that. He's like, we'll always call ourselves that just to remind them how wrong they were. And so I remember as a little kid, like trying to like conceptualize that, right? Because of course I didn't know the history of Columbus coming, not knowing where he was, seeing brown people with black hair and being like, oh, I'm in India.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
did. I had
yeah.
no idea of that as like a 5 or 6 year old. But as time evolved, right, and as I kind of got more immersed in like an urban Indian community, which thankfully, my family really they pushed that forward. We were
Mm,
urban, absolutely, in Denver, Colorado. Arapaho land, Cheyenne traditional lands, downtown Denver, inner city. But we were still going to powwow. You
mm,
know, we were still going to the Urban Indian Center, and so my family really pushed that forward. And so as I got older, I kept doing those kind of things. It was like, okay, I'm moving to Kansas City. Okay, where's the Indian Center?
yeah,
Okay, I'm moving to Portland. Okay, where's the Indian Center? And that was just like, okay, that's where I'm going, right? And that's where I go to have my monthly potlucks. That's where I go to find community, or just go to hear where the best powwow is. Either way,
right.
either way, I'm
Still
going.
important. Yeah.
I'm still going. Okay. But in pushing that narrative forward, kind of as I got more immersed, I want to say like in my 20s, I was
Mm,
like, urban Indian, that is actually more, that is a real view of my upbringing and who I am. And so when I say that, or when I tell folks that, especially folks from res and folks who have their Indian residency or have their status card, right? Which is folks who are recognized as Native American by the federal government. We are the last ethnicity and race next to dogs and
mm,
horses
yeah.
that have to have racial status through the government based on blood quantum to be
Yeah.
recognized as Native.
Yep.
And from my family's teachings, right? I have my blood quantum down to the 8th. A lot of
Mm,
Native people have it down to the 16th. It's very intense, and it's very it's very much a colonial concept meant to continue the genocide so that folks don't have access to land.
mm,
When we talk about the erasure and the genocide against Indigenous people, it always comes back to land.
yeah.
Um, and if we are if they've gotten fully rid of us, then they can continue on their plan of neo-colonialization, or of colonizing
Yeah.
every inch of land and space that is this place we all live on, Turtle Island.
Sure.
Right.
And for those that aren't as familiar with the term, can you explain what blood quantum is speaking to?
Right. So blood quantum is something that colonialists used, right? Like our Columbuses, our conquistadors.
Hmm.
And what they wanted to do was they wanted to create racial hierarchies. Okay. So one of the main things was the rule of thigh, and trigger warning. Colonialism is very triggering, but this includes sexual assault.
Mm,
Um especially the conquistadors throughout Mexico and the southern United States would say the rule of thigh is that in raping an Indigenous woman or a brown woman, you bring her status because her child will become lighter, right? And so that's kind of like that narrative of blood quantum in my mind is, okay, the more European
Yep.
we whittle down the bloodline, the better the
Yep.
offspring will be. So it's really like a deeply white supremacist narrative, right? And it's hard because we have, you know, and I don't think this is any secret, but I think it's good to be upfront that in, you know, multi-tribal indigenous communities here in Turtle Island, we still have some blood quantum problems. You
Of
know,
course.
we've got folks who, you know, some of my family that are mixed with African American and Native, and there's a problem there. There's anti-blackness happening. There's
Yep.
questioning happening of their status and their indigenous identity. I've got family members that are mixed with even like white, you know, like redheads and light hair, and their status isn't being as questioned as much. So we still have some of those colonial
Yep.
mindsets that came in from blood quantum. Even some folks like, you know, I'm a full blood, you
Mm,
know, like,
mm.
and I do think it speaks to something, right? Something that's
Oh,
internalized inside
yeah.
of us, right? But it also speaks to we're surviving this
Yes.
genocide,
Yep.
and a lot of effects come out of that. And
Yeah.
I say that as someone with two bloodlines who's survived genocides,
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
just like see it,
Yeah.
you know.
And this idea of blood quantum and the internalized oppression that you're speaking to is consistent among any population that has had to deal with European colonization, right? It shows up as colorism in India, Pakistan. It shows up as colorism in Black and African American communities. A hierarchy based upon how light or dark you are. It shows up similarly in Brazil, Central and South America. And so the whiteness as the standard was kind of perpetuated pretty much through the entire globe, right? They missed a couple spots here and there, but they got pretty far. And that hatred, that categorization has been internalized by many of us. And then we perpetuate that as hatred, violence, or judgment against ourselves and our brothers and sisters and our kin, and just continue to further the psychological damage and harm. So it's one of
Absolutely.
the many awful links that I see in the story of colonization and the story of oppression and survival that Native and Indigenous folks have endured, and other oppressed communities throughout the world have had to endure as well. And
Even down to
so,
hair texture, facial features. I mean, it's so deeply
yeah,
laced with the, you know, white supremacist poisonous
yeah,
idea.
and it still affects, beauty standards today. When you think about who you see as the actresses and models on TV, and you can look. This is true in the U.S. This is true in Central and South America. This is true in Bollywood. It's by and large lighter skinned folks because that is still seen to be closer to whiteness and the normalized beauty standard. Darker skinned folks have a harder time breaking through and breaking in. We're seeing that shift a little, but it's still by and large the norm.
Even this last powwow season, I had, you know, my young ones out there, and I had, you know, an abuela grandma come to me and say, you know, just get a little hairspray. I'll get a
Mm,
little hairspray on there because they have naturally curly hair. And in the back right here, where some of us have our, you know, pretty straight hair, you can just bobby pin it or hairspray it and it lays flat. But their curls are not meant to do that, you know.
right.
They pop out here and they pop out here, and that, you know, grandma was pushing forward
Yeah.
that colonial understanding of, you know, we don't want to see the curls. We want the hair to look flat and straight. We want the braids to look flat and straight,
Yeah.
because that's perceived to be more beautiful,
Yep.
right? It's like Native peoples, we come in Turtle Island alone, we come in every shade that you could think of. And
Yeah.
when we say Black Indigenous people of color, there's that I there for Indigenous, because not all Native people are people of color. Some Native people are white, right?
Mm.
And white passing, and they
Mm.
still are absolutely Indigenous.
Yeah.
Okay. And there are some Indigenous people that are Black and
Yep.
that are still absolutely Indigenous. And in the idea of the look of Indigenous, or the idea of the look of Latina, it's a
Exactly.
myth, y'all. Like, let it go. Okay.
Right.
It's not real. It is not real.
Yeah.
And often perpetuated by the white gaze, right? Or by
Absolutely.
fetishism or exotification. So it's
Right.
like, let that go. Future.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
going to the future now.
Oh
Oh,
man. So let's jump in. Let's talk about colonization and genocide. Um, Again, thinking back to history as it was taught to me in K through 12, we learned about the smallpox blankets. We learned, um,
you
at
know that was
best,
dirty and trifling.
uh, one of many trifling things that
Just
have
dirty.
happened. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Well,
so,
so we learned about smallpox. We learned about
right.
the Trail of Tears.
Got
And
it.
we're like, okay, yeah, our ancestors might have killed a few people along the
Maybe
way.
something happens. I don't know.
Right. Andrew
Uh,
Jackson was not a great president. But
no.
that's where the story stops, right?
Right.
And so most of us don't grow up with an idea that indigenous native folks are still here, still among us. We think about it, college applications. Oh, I'm a eighth Cherokee, I get a scholarship. But
Right.
that is as far as we have an awareness of it. So
Right.
I really want us to talk about the ways in which the genocide is still happening. Um,
Absolutely.
a recent story that came up was the mass graves that have been showing up at these schools, private schools, boarding schools, Catholic schools, um, that non-native folks are like, oh my God, how could this have happened? Native
And we're
folks are
like,
like, we told you, we have been telling you, this not only happened, it's still happening, y'all. So I say all that to say we don't know anything. Help us understand how the genocide is still occurring.
okay. So I just want to speak to something you said in the beginning, which is, we're always framed in the past,
Yeah.
right? We're always framed as the Chiefs, the football mascot. We're always framed like pre-contact,
Yeah.
but we're not framed modern, which like
Mhm.
we literally are still here. So it's like not like a little rude. It's a little messed up. Young people in those pictures from 200-300 years ago. I'm like, can we like
Can we
okay.
update this? Update your stereotype, y'all.
Can we could you just imagine like all you ever see is pictures of like black folks from 200 years ago? You're like, I'm a little off put.
Yeah.
But seriously though, when I think, and it's hard for me to conceptualize sometimes because my dad is just this like rustic urban Indian motorcycle riding, bandana wearing, former American Indian movement type guy. So I have this really like, just chingon like
Mhm.
understanding of like native people in my mind because it was my dad,
Yeah.
right? And so sometimes it's hard for me to like conceptualize not knowing. Does that make sense? Do you
Yeah.
know what I
Yep.
mean? Like it's hard for me to be like, we don't exist, but I know that that is some people's reality, especially far out east, right?
Mhm.
Like far out east, and I lived in DC. I've lived near Detroit. It really is a lot less represented native peoples,
Yeah.
and there are native people there. But when I'm in the Southwest, I'm like, there we are, there we are, there we are. And maybe I'm seeing it because I know,
Mm.
or maybe I'm seeing it because there's more representation.
Mm.
But I do feel that as you cross over Turtle Island. So folks are coming from New Jersey, coming from the far East Coast, or even the Midwest, and they're like, I'm a little bit off by the Midwest because everything's named after native tribes. I don't know if y'all just thought like
It
some of those names
is.
were like, no, those are like native words and
Right.
native tribes. Um, but the genocide did start with the smallpox blankets. It did start with the TP creepers or the folks that were mass murdering people in their
Mm.
sleep. It did start with the kidnapping, right?
Yeah.
And that's such a colonial understanding, that you go someplace you've never been and then you steal people from there and bring them back with you. This is
Right.
not something we were like doing.
No.
Like even as warriors, even as raiders, or of like some of the most intense warriors of the Southwest, like I'm not reading about how we, went over to what is now called Puerto Rico
Mhm.
and took some people and came back. Like that
Yeah.
that
Not a
okay.
common practice.
Not a common practice, but definitely a colonial practice and a start of the genocide, right? When we're reading through Columbus's diaries, which
Mm,
Have something with you, whatever your religion, have that with you while you
yeah.
read Columbus's diaries, because that's like reading
Oof,
Mein Kampf.
oof,
It's
right.
rough,
No, for real.
it really
Yeah.
is rough. But like one of his practices and his men's practices was to catch the most hairless woman, small woman they could find. So pretty much a pubescent, teenager, like 10, 11 years old,
Mm,
and kidnap her. That was like, okay, we're here, guys. Let's eat, let's kidnap, let's go.
yeah.
And so, like, thinking back, like, that's something that's still going on right now, missing and murdered Indigenous women
Yeah.
and peoples.
Yep.
It's not just our women anymore, it's elders, it's children. And this is just through kidnapping, sex slave trade, and cartel.
Yeah.
This isn't even talking about like stealing children to go to the boarding schools or the child what Indian Welfare Act, which we had so many children stolen by the government, they had to make us our own welfare act. They're
Yeah.
like, y'all are right, too many native children are literally disappearing,
Right.
y'all are gonna have your own law
Right.
that you keep your own kids. And right now, a huge oil company is trying to overturn that law in Texas
Of
to
course.
protect, right? Because they want
Texas.
land.
Yeah.
And so if they get native children out of their homes, especially native children that are on reservation, that is going to make it so the next descendant to caretake for the land or to be on our traditional land isn't going to be there.
Yeah.
So like I totally see the game, right? I see it mapped out for me, but then it's stopping these multi-million-dollar companies or just getting people even aware of it to really push it forward.
Yep.
You know what I
Yep.
mean? The understand.
Absolutely.
Um, Being dirty, I colonialists and Europeans, you don't have a good history of being cleanly.
Mm,
And this comes from soap.
mm,
Soap was one of the biggest trades that we did with Europeans when they arrived here because they were still using methods of ash, which I don't know if you know about, but it is where you burn something like, like almost like wood, and
yeah.
it creates ash, and then clothes, garments, and blankets were washed in ash. That's why we had a really big problem during the Spanish flu. That's why we had a really big problem during the Black Plague in London. It was because of those cleanliness practices,
Mm,
right? Thankfully, in my Jewish culture and also in my native culture, cleaning is very important.
yeah.
It's almost like a religiously affiliated sacred way to be. And so, in
Hmm.
how you wash your hair and how you wash your blankets and how you do things is important, right?
Yeah.
And so, when I think back to the smallpox blankets, like, was that intentional, or was that
Yes.
an intellectual misnomer, or both?
I mean, yes.
Because if you're washing, I'm serious,
Yeah.
because if you're washing infectious things with ashes, that's not going to get them clean. We
Right.
even skin wash or sun wash things, which means, we wash them like very sacredly, and then we put them out in the sun for 2 days so that they
Hmm.
bleach in the
Hmm.
sun to get to like the next level of cleanliness. So I'm kind of like, I'm really upset that some people didn't know that. They should have
Yeah.
known better.
Yeah.
But also, buffaloes, our main food source went extinct, based on literally, colonizing the West.
Yep.
Our practices of hunting, gathering, and farming were made illegal, which I think is something that people don't talk about enough. But I think I shared with you, and I try to always share with my native audiences, that I'm deeply blessed to have my great auntie Chubby, which is my grandmother's sister, still alive. She's between 94 and 96. We don't know how old she is because she doesn't have a birth certificate, but she remembers when the Jehovah's Witnesses came onto our land. They are our colonizers, and gave us rations, right? And our rations, she
Mm,
said she had never seen anything pure white. And our rations were flour, powdered milk, and sugar. And
yeah.
she just said, that's when they're going to kill us with our food. And this is after the Apache Wars. This is after, our people were imprisoned in Florida. This is after a long time of war, right? And
Yeah.
so you say, okay, how you get food, how you make food, that's illegal now. This is what you eat, right? And now we have like a predisposition to diabetes. Well,
Yep.
is that colonial, or is that based on the colonial foods that we were brought and forced to eat?
Right.
You know, so
Right. Yeah. So I'm glad that you kind of enumerated those different ways. And I want folks to understand that when we talk about the genocide of indigenous folks, we're not just talking about literal raiding of villages or literal attacking of people. That still happens, but there are a lot of different ways that indigenous populations are oppressed, marginalized, and I mean even like destroyed, be it through the food, through environmental pollution, through continued taking of land that was promised via treaty, like that should be legally binding, but the U.S. just pretends it isn't, and through this continued practice of missing and murdered indigenous people. Like, I mean, this has been going on in Canada for a long time. It's been going on in the U.S. for a long time. It's happening in Mexico. Just indigenous women are disappearing at alarming rates, and it does not get the media coverage, the news coverage of other people groups disappearing and other people groups being murdered and targeted. There have been serial killers that have specifically kind of targeted these groups of people, and the police have, not taken it that seriously. Whereas if it had been when it's white women being killed, the police are on that mess. So I almost slipped there. I had to censor myself.
I'm
uh,
surprised I haven't cussed yet. I'm actually very impressed with
you're
myself.
doing great. So I want people to understand that this is a very real, ongoing attack on thousands of people, different people groups, different tribes, different clans, and it is still happening today and not getting nearly enough coverage and attention. And it's tragic, terribly tragic.
It is. Um, yeah, trigger warning. Native women listening out there, because you already know. I grabbed my corn so I could talk about this, because
Mm,
it is, it's deeply triggering. I come from my great grandma, who is from southern, what is now called New Mexico, was taken 3 times.
mm,
Okay, and each time she was taken by banditos, or northern Mexican mestizos. And our first colonizer was Mexico. It's hard, I know, for most non-native people to conceptualize, but Mexico was colonized for 400 years. My people have been under colonial power for a little over 100 years.
yeah.
And so when we think about and talk about the genocide, like, it's very fresh in my blood. And some folks can't remember, like, I talked to some of my southern native cousins, and they don't know their tribe. Like, they're
Mm,
like, yeah, I'm native from like here. And like, I'm like, oh, what's that called? Like, what, and they're like, I don't know. I don't
yeah.
know, because it's been a lot longer for them. And I try to have like empathy and conceptualize with that. But sometimes it's hard for me to comprehend. Um, when we talk about folks on the East Coast, our relatives, our native relatives on that far East Coast that were touched first by colonialism. It's been a long time, you know. And so sometimes it's hard to conceptualize the genocide and its duration, right? But I will say, let me just take a pause here so I can collect all my
Mm-hmm.
vision.
Mm-hmm.
People being taken is a colonial practice, and it was a conquistador practice. Okay, and it is a macho, it is a masculine practice. This isn't something we have documentation of women going in and kidnapping women. Okay, this is a male dominated crime. um, and so when we think about all the native peoples, we've all been terrorized by male violence right here on this continent and in this land. And the land is terrorized by male violence through the oil industry, and we see that the land is conquered and raped and not taken care of. And you can see that anytime an oil line is built, the amount of pollution and just desecration of the land that takes place is just it's not even, like, I can't even speak to it, because it's just devastating.
Yeah.
It's devastating. And that's something that's really frustrating, that in European cultures, a lot of European cultures are colonized themselves, and have been for many years, to the point of non-remembering of their nations and of their clans and their tribes and traditions. Um, so I see that in them as well, like that sickness there. Um, but even there, we're not having the conversations that I've ever heard of the land underneath you produces your health,
Mm,
you know and it's almost like it's like common sense
yeah.
in native culture that, like, when I go outside and I lay down on the ground, or I go outside and my dog eats the grass, or I go outside and I'm sitting there eating my apples from my tree that this land produces for me, am I thinking, oh, I wish this was filled with tar, or like, I
Mm,
hope there's like unsewered waste underneath this, or
yeah.
like, like a chemical spill.
Yeah.
Like, those are not the thoughts that enter in my mind. My mind are thinking things like, okay, like, this is a blessing, and like, there's no chemicals or poison on this land that I've put on this land I'm caretaking for, and that's a blessing.
Yeah.
Now I get to eat this apple. Like, what a joy, what a blessing, what a privilege to be able to eat fresh things that come from the land I caretake for. That's a
Yep.
privilege and a blessing. And so I don't know if that got skipped in some cultures or not, or
Mm,
forgotten knowledge.
yeah.
But when we have dumps of nuclear waste
Yep.
underneath us, like in Colorado, right? Federally
Yep.
recognized and like totally like it on Arapaho Cheyenne land.
Mm,
When we have oil companies trying to buy Chacos, New Mexico, one of our oldest ruins in New Mexico, right? Where we found like dinosaur bones. Like, come on,
yeah.
people, like, this is significant. 10,000 and longer, longer for most than most white folks can conceptualize when
Yeah.
we're talking about history, right? 10,000 years. We want to dig up for oil. you
Yep.
know
Yep.
it's like we have an addiction. We have an addiction to capital. As a Western culture, there is
Yeah.
an obsession and addiction to more.
Yep.
And so that lesson was taught to me very young. And it was taught to me that to be in a good way is to not have too much of everything, to not gain too much of all the things, but to have things in moderation.
Yeah.
And that is something I don't often hear from my Jewish family, but something that is just like, knocking on that wood all the time from my native relations.
Yep.
Um, Greed and access is, taken away from your spirit
Yep.
and who you are. And so I think that culture, though, has been perpetuated through Western society. And that's why we have the continued genocide and erasure of Native people, and why we go missing, and why so many of our strongest leaders are women in matriarchies and they go missing. They're
Yeah.
targeted by violence. People want to kill them. And it's mainly big industry, and I think that's harder for people to conceptualize, that a lot of these huge corporations are mafioso,
Yep.
you know,
Oh. Oh
okay.
yeah. Oh yeah.
When you buy out the lobbyists and you buy out the government systems that are supposed to regulate you and do this kind of stuff, it's like a cartel. It's like, we got a bunch of like very low key, like indigenous folks living on remote land trying to fight multi-billion-dollar companies.
There's a story I saw recently, I think it was in Minnesota, in which, there's I don't know if it's an oil or but it's a natural kind of, gas or resource company, and they have the county sheriff combating indigenous protesters that are protesting the work that they're doing because it's harming the land. The city and the county said, "Hey, we shouldn't have to pay for this." And so the company is reimbursing and paying for the
Holy,
public police officers and sheriffs to basically brutalize the indigenous protesters whose
yeah.
land it actually is anyway. I mean,
Does it
you
blow your
cannot skip
mind?
this. It's
Like, I'm
it,
like,
it's
am I in a bad villain movie?
no, for real.
Damn.
We are. We are, by the way.
We
Yes.
are. It's
Yeah.
not good for us.
No, it's not. It's not. So there's a
Laughing through the
way in
pain.
which it's what'd you say?
I said laughing through the pain.
You have to. You
You
have
have
to.
to.
But I,
You
I
have
don't think non-native folks, like myself, understand the degree to which there's a concerted effort and an interconnection between industry, government, and then some of these other rogue agents. Like, we have these conspiracy theories about the Illuminati, or we get on to individual politicians for not doing enough. But man, the leeway we've given private organizations and companies, and
They're people
capitalism.
now.
I mean, you're right.
They
They
literally
are.
are.
And they've literally
Like,
been the cause of assassinations, imprisonments. They
yeah.
have killed, people, organizers, and activists across the globe,
Yep.
not just here in the
Yep.
US. Uh,
Yep.
it's just tragic, and again, it's something that doesn't get enough attention and awareness, but it is absolutely part and perpetuating this genocide that we're talking about.
Just speaking on modern missing and missing Indigenous and Indian women and girls. These oil companies come in with man camps, right? And just imagine, like, and I know you're in Indiana, so you can imagine rural, but imagine even more rural than that. Imagine each, like, sometimes when I'm in New Mexico, I see signs that say 90 miles to the next gas station, and I think to myself, like, that is off-putting,
Right.
but off-putting, and like, this is rural. So you've
Yeah.
got a long distance till you get to the next place. Indiana, maybe got 20 minutes, maybe got 20
Sure.
miles, but just, a long distance between where people were allowed to settle, right, on the land. And so when we talk about that, we talk about man camps, you think, okay, you're about to put, 60 to 120 men. I've never once in my life met a female oil driller. Never. Because the work environment is really probably deeply sexist on machismo, I would assume.
Yeah.
But most of these camps are, a good amount of men. Most of them don't have background checks. And when we talk about like oil industry, construction industry, these are not industries that are doing like, oh yeah, do you have any charges against you in terms of like violence towards women, violence towards children? No, these background checks are not happening. People are being hired, getting paid under the table, and they're living in these remote settings for 6 months to 2 years or longer. That large amount.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the numbers of like women sexually assaulted, women missing, domestic violence, we're seeing my experience, which is Indigenous women being hurt, brutalized by white men. And we're this only group, like we're this only statistic that has this huge amount of predominantly white men attacking us and taking us, as opposed to the rest of women, right? Women who identify as Black, women who identify as Asian, having a more multicultural background of attackers.
Yeah.
And so, when the man camps come in, the violence goes up.
Yep.
Right? And that's something that's not really being looked at or really being taken into account. In our South, for our South natives, we have the cartels, not just taking one or two or three people, taking a clan, going to somebody's house and everybody's got to go and everybody's about to farm, and that's some of the disparities that we have between us and what is now the United States and what we have in folks that are in Mexico. And those are those are fights I've had. Can you believe, like, we have it harder than you because they take our whole clan? Well, we have it harder than you because just one's missing and we don't know, and we're literally fighting over whose colonial process is more painful.
Right.
You're like, this is literally the dumbest fight y'all can have right now. Y'all should just quit, both of you. You're like, no, I seriously had it worse. Seriously.
Right. You both lost. Let's move on.
Literally, you both got punched in the face with a golf shoe, okay?
Right.
Y'all, but I'm laughing because that is literally like, we're in conflict about that through nationalism, right? We're in conflict with folks from the islands, who are Indigenous because we're from the mainland.
Yep.
Like these things have just like happened over time. You're like, this doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
But it feels better to fight about something that you're never going to win, or an argument that doesn't matter, than to take a deeper look at what's going on, right? So it's a distraction method.
Yep.
Right? And so you'll get into debates or conversations with Indigenous folks that just want to fight about blood quantum, who just want to fight about adoption outside of Indian country, And it's like, these are not the debates we need to have. The debates we need to have are, how are we going to get the land back?
Yep.
How are we going to be able to self-govern? None of the treaties have been held to be accountable.
Right.
Every treaty is a lie. So it's like, okay, so if there are no treaties, how are we going to be able to govern ourselves?
Yep.
Right? When the colonial government decides every piece of land and property, when they are in cahoots, are, having some type of relationship behind the doors of these business arrangements, like land grabs, where the federal government says all this land is federally protected, nobody can buy it, and then they have a private auction that's only told to 100 people,
right?
And it's 2 days. In 2 days, you're like,
make it make sense.
You're like, you all really just made $8 billion because you did a 48-hour land grab,
right?
Like, I see you being shady. I'm not stupid.
Right?
I know how this works.
Man, so as we bring this convo to a close, we've reflected on um the diversity among indigenous population, the history of colonialism and genocide. But I want to bring us back to the question that we started this episode with. What would it take for us to keep our native and indigenous familia safe? And so I'm going to throw out a couple of things that I think our listeners can do, both small and big picture. And then I'll invite you, Keebler, to add whatever you think you want to add to answer this question. And specifically thinking about and answering this for the audience, which is predominantly non-native, right? These are largely white folks, Anabaptists. What can we do to kind of do our part to keep native folks safe? And I think the first thing I would say is just diversify the people you're following, your news sources, so that you are more aware of these stories as they're happening. There are places like Mennonite Mission Network, people that are working there that have access to these stories and access to these communities. And so just make sure that you are tapping into those news outlets, the connections that you have in your communities and your faith tradition, so that you hear more of them, so that the stories can be told. And as the stories are told, you'll find something that tugs in your heart, and you might be able to use the resources you have, the connections you have, to try to help a community, a clan, a tribe fight whatever it is that they're fighting. So first of all, we just have to hear more of the stories. Part of the reason this conversation is important, because oppressors really want to rewrite history and to make sure the stories aren't told. But if the stories are told and the truth is told, then people can be mobilized to make a difference and an impact. So I think that's one simple thing that we can do: begin to just kind of be in places to hear more of these stories. Second, I would encourage us to really pay more attention to some of these longstanding environmental fights. Um, there have been several high-profile fights over pipelines, especially in the U.S. within the last 5 to 10 years, and they might make the news cycle for a little bit. Some of the police brutality makes the news cycle for a little bit, but then it dies down, and you just have a small group of folks left fighting for their land, their lives, and their future. When we've got abundant resources, we could help, right? We could be doing more. We can be supporting them more, applying political pressure, or offering financial support. So just kind of being aware of those fights that are still happening, the people that are still trying to keep pipelines from happening, fracking from happening, and destroying their communities. So those are the two things that come to my mind that we can do off rip to help ensure that we're creating a safer place, so that our indigenous and native familia can thrive. What would you add to that, Keebler?
I would add following or looking into the Apache Stronghold, the Apache Language Project 2020, looking into on res artists, skateboarders, fashion makers, jewelry makers, and supporting communities, supporting Indigenous communities directly. I would say follow and financially support, especially for our non native relatives that have the capital, are water protectors, land defenders, folks that are forefront in the MMIW movement, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, or MMIWG, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I would say follow performers.
Hmm.
We've got some amazing Apache performers, actors. We've got some amazing Indigenous performers and actors. Res Dogs, just came to TV. Like, we have these new things that are indigenously led, indigenously written, and those are the things that need to be bought into. Those are the things that need to be watched and prioritized to give back to Indigenous folks. What was the first one that you had mentioned?
Just diversifying our media sources, so we're hearing more of these stories.
Okay. Yeah, I would say definitely looking into, when you go to these tags, looking into the individual people that are tagged under these
Mm.
posts as land and water defenders. Sometimes they'll have campaigns. They'll ask for fiscal benefits or spiritual practices that they'd like to happen for them, and just supporting those things.
Yeah. Excellent list, and we'll make sure that we get all these in the show notes for this episode. We're doing the live stream now. Obviously, this will also be a audio only podcast episode that'll go out. So we'll get all these in the show notes. And we'll also put links to several other Indigenous people that I follow that I think y'all should support, as well as a link to Keebler's business. By the way, can you tell folks a little bit about Decolonize and Thrive? Let them know what kind of services that you offer.
Sure. So in Decolonize and Thrive, after Black Lives Matter blew up this year, I was in my house for the pandemic, doing caretaking for one of my young ones that has a pre existing condition. And I just had to change my activism. Like before, I was out on the streets protester, I was going in, I was lobbying, I was doing actions, hunger strikes. And then all of a sudden, it's like, okay, now I'm a stay at home mom, and there's also a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of sat myself down and I was like, how can I still be a part of the things that are in alignment with my morals? How can I still put food on the table, meaning money? And how can I do it and be like in a good way, be a good partner, be a good mother, be a good matriarchy to my aunties and my siblings, and to my parents as a caretaker? How do I do this? And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start a business. And you know me, I'm not very tech savvy. I'm not very like,
Sure.
I'm not on that as much as I
Right.
should be, right? But I was like, I'm gonna make my own website. I was like, I'm gonna record my own workshops, and I was like, I'm gonna cater them to what folks need.
Mm.
And so that's what I do now. I'm a consultant. I give workshops. I help do strategic planning for businesses, nonprofits, collectives, and I give rates, based on folks' identity, and I have a sliding rate. And I think that's a part of our decolonial process. I don't, I prioritize folks. I prioritize Indigenous folks. I prioritize Black folks. I prioritize our femme relatives, our trans relatives, our two spirit relatives,
Yeah.
our gender non binary relatives. And that's really for my nieces and nephews. They're like way cooler than me. Like, I'm just an auntie, and they're like, Auntie, like, I know you're getting old. I'm like, I'm just a queer. And they're like, that's so like 2000. Like,
Right.
one of them told me I was born in like the late 1900s. I was like, you
Oh,
really you
it's
really gonna
true,
call
but it
1990
sounds so
the
bad.
late 1900s?
Like,
I was
dang.
like, oh my, clutch my pearls.
Right.
Not the late
Not
1900s.
the late 1900s. Oof.
So,
Uh,
but they're like always getting me hip. They're always getting me there. We're having talks about what it means to be a light native, to be a white
mhm.
passing native. What does it mean to be how we appear?
Yeah.
And kind of have it like, I had I had my teenage niece or nephew, put help me describe how I appear to my audience that was visually impaired.
Mm,
And so it was like, okay, so like I'm conceptualizing these things that were never
yeah.
cool in the
Yeah.
late 19th century.
Yeah.
And that now, in 2021, 22 are like absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is this
It'll be
video going to be
2022.
closed caption?
It should be.
We should be.
Yeah.
We should be.
Yeah.
So,
So yeah, so for folks and organizations that are interested in learning more about anti-racism, decolonization, you can check out Decolonize and Thrive. We'll also put that link in the show notes.
thank
And you think about hiring hiring Kibler on for contract work. Old habits.
you. Old habits die hard.
I know. So yeah,
Yes. I
with
appreciate that plug. Yep.
of course, of course. Thank you so much, fam, for being on today. We
Thank you.
appreciate you. Appreciate the wisdom and the knowledge and the leadership that you bring. It's invaluable, and I hope that you understand that and that you know that.
Thank you, fam. I appreciate you. Thank you for having me. Thanks, folks, for listening. And thank you to my families for raising me and this wonderful land that I'm on that's taken really good care of me. So,
All right, y'all. Until next time, this has been What Would It Take?